Dozens of fresh footprints across the sanctuary floor. Not old, recent, hundreds maybe, different sizes, different shoes. They led nowhere, just ended where the carpet began. That discovery bothered me more than anything before it, because it implied gatherings, large ones, community events continuing somewhere beyond my awareness. The realization settled into my head and refused to leave. If people were hiding, they weren't scattered individuals, they were coordinated. That possibility sounded absurd, yet evidence kept supporting it. During the 6th week, I saw a light switch off behind a curtain, not a flicker, not a reflection, an actual light. 2nd floor of the Wilkins house. I was driving past at dusk when it happened. The room glowed yellow for a second, then darkness. I slammed the brakes. The house became still. I approached quietly, every window covered, every door locked. I circled the property. Behind the house, I found muddy shoe prints leading toward the woods. For once, the trail didn't disappear immediately. I followed it. The prints joined others, then more. Eventually, they formed a path, not an official trail. A route used repeatedly by many people. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. The path wound through trees for nearly a mile before reaching an old maintenance building near the reservoir. The place should have been abandoned. Instead, dozens of vehicles were hidden among the trees. Cars, trucks, bicycles. I crouched behind brush and stared. Voices drifted from inside. Real voices. Human voices. Casual conversation. Laughter. The sound hit me harder than anything else. After weeks of silence, it felt unreal. I moved closer. One window stood slightly open. I could hear people talking. Can't keep doing double deliveries forever. A man sounded exhausted. Someone laughed. Another voice said, "He's still checking Main Street every morning. Did he see you?" "No." "Be careful." Then silence. Another speaker, female this time. "How much longer?" A long pause followed. Finally, somebody answered, "As long as it takes." I kept listening. My legs hurt from crouching, but I couldn't move. Then I heard my name. Not shouted, just mentioned casually. The room went quiet for a second. Someone sighed. "I almost feel sorry for him sometimes." Another voice immediately responded, "Don't." I said almost. The chair scraped. Somebody else spoke. "You weren't there after Emily died." More silence. "My brother still can't walk right. We're all tired, okay? I'm just saying this whole thing is the only reason he stayed." I remember every word, because I replay them constantly. The conversation continued. Fragments mostly, enough to understand. They weren't hiding from a disaster. They were hiding from me. The town never disappeared. It reorganized itself. Businesses operated through back entrances. Residents coordinated schedules. Curtains stayed closed. People communicated through private networks and radios. Whenever I approached an area, warnings spread. Everyone cleared out. Public life vanished only in my presence. I backed away from the window and nearly stumbled. My brain kept rejecting what I'd heard. It was too extreme, too ridiculous. Yet it explained everything. The moved objects, the footprints, the food disappearing, the hidden gatherings, all of it. I should have left then. Instead, I stayed. I listened longer than I should have. People discussed supply runs. School lessons held in private homes. Rotating meeting locations. Strategies for avoiding accidental encounters. They sounded tired, not angry, tired. Like maintaining my isolation had become another civic responsibility. Eventually, someone mentioned seeing me in town earlier that day. A few people chuckled. One man said, "You looked right at my truck and never realized I was under the tarp." More laughter. Not cruel exactly, just weary, familiar. Like coworkers discussing a difficult job. That's what broke me. Not the blame, not even the rejection. The normality. They had built an entire version of society that functioned without me, and after enough months it had become routine. I left before anyone noticed. Back home, I sat at my kitchen table until sunrise. The next morning, I tested the truth. I drove to Main Street and parked in the middle of the road. Then I waited. Hours passed. Nothing. Finally, I left town limits and drove several miles away. Then I turned around unexpectedly and came back fast. For a brief moment, I saw movement everywhere. A woman unlocking a storefront, kids crossing a street, two men unloading supplies. The second they noticed my truck, everything changed. Doors closed, people vanished, like a stage performance ending mid-scene. Within minutes, the town appeared empty again. After that, I stopped searching for explanations. I already had one. Months have passed since then. I still live here. Leaving would probably be smarter, but part of me keeps hoping somebody will eventually decide the punishment is over. Nobody has. Sometimes I catch glimpses, a face behind glass, a vehicle turning down another road. Once I walked into the grocery store and heard conversation in the next aisle. By the time I reached it, the aisle was empty, fully stocked, not a person in sight. The strangest thing is that life continues. Lawns get mowed, roads get repaired. Nail appears. Holidays happen behind closed doors. The town is alive, just not for me. Last winter, I found a handwritten schedule accidentally left on a bulletin board. It listed gathering locations and warning procedures. My name appeared several times, not as a threat, more like weather, something to monitor, something to route around. I put the paper back where I found it. Nobody ever came to retrieve it while I was watching. They waited until I left. Sometimes I think about moving away and starting over somewhere nobody knows me. Then I remember something one of those voices said in the reservoir building. Not the part about Emily. Another sentence. Choir, easy to miss. A man had asked whether anyone thought I understood what was happening. Somebody answered, maybe, but if he leaves, he'll just be someone else's problem. What keeps me awake isn't the possibility that they hate me. It's the possibility that after all this time, they don't anymore, and they're still choosing not to let me back in. The first thing that didn't make sense was the coffee still dripping into a mug that wasn't there. I was standing inside Miller's diner, staring at a fresh pot brewing behind the counter while every stool sat empty and the front door hung half open. The lights were on, the grill was warm. Somebody had started the morning shift, but there wasn't a single person in the building. I remember actually saying, hello, like an idiot because the silence felt temporary, like everyone had stepped outside for a minute. Nobody answered. I walked behind the counter. The coffee machine clicked. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer beeped once, then stopped. That was the moment I realized I hadn't seen another person all morning. Not on my street, not at the gas station, not at the intersection by the church where there is usually traffic backed up before 8. At first, I thought there'd been some emergency evacuation, a gas leak maybe, a chemical spill, something that made everyone leave fast. But then why hadn't anyone told me? I pulled out my phone, no signal, nothing. Nothing. The little bars were gone completely. I restarted it twice, same thing. I walked outside and looked down Main Street. Our town wasn't huge, maybe 3,000 people, small enough that you recognized faces, big enough that it never felt empty. That morning it looked abandoned. Cars sat in driveways. Bikes were left in yards. A city bus was parked crooked beside the curb with the engine off and nobody inside. The strangest part wasn't what was missing. It was how normal everything else looked. A newspaper lay on someone's porch. A sprinkler rotated across a lawn. Wind pushed a grocery receipt down the sidewalk. It looked like everybody had vanished in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. I spent most of that first day trying to come up with reasonable explanations. I checked houses, not by breaking in at first, just knocking, calling out, looking through windows. Every home looked lived in, beds unmade, televisions paused, breakfast dishes and sinks, but no people. Around noon, I went to the police station, empty, 2 patrol cars outside, 1 computer screen glowing behind the front desk. The station smelled like somebody had just microwaved lunch. I found myself talking out loud constantly, narrating what I was doing, not because I was scared exactly, more because silence started feeling unnatural after a while. Human brains expect little sounds, footsteps, distant conversations, doors closing. Once those disappear, Every room feels wrong. By sunset, I was sitting on the hood of my truck, trying to convince myself help would arrive in the morning. Maybe communications were down everywhere. Maybe the National Guard would show up. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't thought of. Then I noticed something that bothered me. Across the street, the Henderson house had lights on when I first drove by. Now they were off. I stared at the windows for a long time. Maybe a timer. Lots of people use timers. I went home. I barely slept. The next morning, the town was still empty. Day 2 felt different because the shock wore off. That's when practical problems started. I drove 20 miles toward the nearest highway. No traffic, no people. Several cars sat abandoned along the road. None appeared damaged, just left there. I kept expecting to find somebody, a state trooper, a stranded family, anyone. Instead, I found a roadblock outside town, not an official one, just construction barriers dragged across the road. They hadn't been there before. I knew that because I'd driven past that exact spot the previous day. Somebody had moved them during the night. I got out and looked around. Fresh footprints in the dirt. Not many, but enough. Human footprints. Recent. I remember feeling relieved more than alarmed. Someone was here. Someone had to be. I followed the tracks for maybe a quarter mile before losing them near a drainage ditch. By afternoon, I was checking every building more aggressively. Grocery store, library, school, medical clinic. The elementary school nearly broke me. Tiny backpacks hanging on hooks, crayon drawings taped to walls, a half-finished lesson written on a whiteboard. It looked like the students had been interrupted midday and never returned. Around 3 o'clock, I heard a sound, a metal clang. Loud enough to echo. It came from behind the gymnasium. I ran toward it. Nobody there, just a side gate slowly swinging in the wind. But the wind wasn't strong enough to move it. I stood there for several minutes trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Then I noticed the gate latch was still vibrating. Somebody had touched it recently. I searched the area. Nothing. That night I started locking every door in my house. Which sounds ridiculous because who was I locking them against? If everyone was gone, it didn't matter. Yet something about the moved barriers and the footprints made me uneasy. On the 3rd day, I began finding little contradictions. Fresh tire tracks where there shouldn't have been any. A garbage can moved from one curb to another. A store shelf that looked rearranged. Tiny things, easy to dismiss individually. Together they formed a pattern. Things were changing while I wasn't looking. One afternoon, I went into the hardware store searching for batteries. The place had been untouched the day before. I was sure of it, yet a ladder now stood near the paint section, not fallen over, positioned neatly, as if someone had used it and put it back. I remember staring at that ladder longer than necessary. I actually tried testing my memory. Maybe I'd overlooked it. Maybe stress was making me misremember. So I started documenting everything. Notes, photos, times, locations. The next morning, one of my notes disappeared. Just one page from the notebook. Nothing else. I searched the house for an hour. Gone. I wish I could explain how unsettling that felt. Not because the note mattered, because somebody had been inside my home. There was no other explanation. I stopped sleeping properly after that. Every noise became significant. Types, wind, the refrigerator compressor. Once I heard footsteps outside around midnight. I grabbed a flashlight and went out immediately. Nobody, but fresh bicycle tracks crossed my driveway. I followed them for several blocks before they vanished on pavement. By the end of the first week, I became obsessed with proving somebody else existed. I painted messages on roads, left water at City Hall, meet here at noon, need help. Nobody came. Yet the water jugs disappeared overnight. I left food in obvious locations. Gone by morning. Once I left a can of peaches balanced on top of a mailbox. The next day the peaches were gone, and the can sat crushed in a trash bin 3 streets away. Someone was watching me. Not occasionally, constantly. I started noticing other things too. Curtains moving when I drove past. Not dramatically, just slight shifts, a shadow withdrawing from a window. A garage door halfway open, that suddenly closed when I turned around. Whenever I investigated, I found nothing. After 2 weeks, my appearance changed. Beard growing, clothes dirty. I talked to myself more. Maybe I looked unstable. Sometimes I wondered whether I was. There were moments when I considered that everyone might actually be gone, and I was inventing evidence, because loneliness does strange things to people. Then I'd find something impossible to explain. Fresh bread cooling on a kitchen counter, a recently extinguished cigarette outside the post office, condensation on a glass. The strongest evidence came during the third week. I was walking through a residential neighborhood when I smelled laundry detergent, clean clothes, strong enough to be recent. I followed the scent to a house near the edge of town. In the backyard, shirts hung on a clothesline, still damp. I checked every room, empty, yet somebody had washed those clothes within the last hour. I sat in that backyard until dark, waiting for whoever lived there to return. Nobody did. Eventually I went home. The next day the clothes were gone. Around then, old memories started creeping back, not because I wanted them to, because I had nothing else to think about. 6 months earlier, there had been an accident. Everyone called it an accident anyway. A school fundraiser. Temporary stage setup. I was supervising equipment. One support wasn't secured properly. I missed it during inspection. A section collapsed. 3 people died. More were injured. One of them was a teenage girl named Emily Harper. She survived for 2 days before complications took her. I knew her family. Everybody knew everybody in town. Investigators concluded it wasn't criminal, just negligence, human error. But that distinction mattered less to the families involved. Afterward, people treated me differently. Not openly hostile, just colder. Conversations shortened. Invitations stopped. At the grocery store, people avoided eye contact. I understood why. I carried the guilt myself. Eventually, things seemed to stabilize, or at least I thought they had. Sitting alone in an empty town, those memories resurfaced constantly. I wondered whether some part of me deserved this. Then I would dismiss the thought because it was irrational. Entire towns don't vanish because they dislike someone. Another month passed. I wish I could say I handled isolation well. I didn't. My routines deteriorated. I wandered, investigated, repeated myself. Every day became a search for evidence. One afternoon I entered the church and found